Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, wherever you are in the world. My name's Kamna Patel, and I'm going to be chairing this book launch today. Just as a reminder, as you're thinking of questions or comments that you want to make to the team or in response to something that they say, please can I ask that you use the Zoom chat feature, which is at the bottom of your screens, and you should just be able to type directly in. If you use the Hoover site, then your questions will be copied from that site to this one so that they're all stored in one place. Just so that you are in the right place, this is the book launch for Inclusive Urban Development in the Global South. Now, all too often there's a flattening of complex personal, interpersonal and communal identities in thinking and writing on urban development planning. So the urban poor or poor urban community is too often and too easily becoming a byword for planning subject. Now, be that the subject of government policy, national media rhetoric, or sometimes even development research. The edited volume illustrates the necessity for thinking with complexity, for understanding the causes and the effects of poverty and marginalization, and that they vary by gender, race, ethnicity, tribe, sexuality, age, and disability, within, between, and across communities. Operationalizing the rich concepts of intersectionality and diversity, the chapters in this book add greater detail, missing detail, to development planning and action in urban areas. It is right and just, and somewhat completes a full circle, that at this DSA conference, this book, which does so much in terms of advancing our thinking on urban equity from a position of people at the margins, a book that is generous in how it guides development scholars in their learning of identity and development, is dedicated to Professor Sylvia Chant. Sylvia was a long-standing member of the DSA and a complete tour de force in staking out the field of gender and development. And she did so, by every account, with compassion and a feminist ethic of care. The dedication in this book reads, for Sylvia, whose ideas, work, and friendship inspired this volume and the life work of so many contributors. The pioneering work on gender and development in cities of the Global South has greatly contributed to a more just world. I feel very fortunate that the legacy of Sylvia's work is being picked up and carried on by so many of my amazing colleagues at the Development Planning Unit at University College London, not least the book editors, Dr. Andrea Rigon, and former colleague, but still very much a colleague, Professor Vanesa Castán Broto. We'll be hearing two presentations today, one from Sylvia's former PhD student and DPU colleague, Jordana Ramalho, on the book chapter that they thought through together on the intersections between puberty, poverty, and gender inequality in urban informal settlements, and Modesta Alozi, a lead research fellow on data and displacement at the University of Warwick and former DPU PhD student, who will be speaking on masculinities in the Niger Delta. I'd like to hand over to Andrea, and before I do, can I please ask that you keep your microphones on mute while our presenters are speaking, but feel free to turn on your camera if you can and if you'd like to, because it's always delightful to see your faces. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kamna, for this fantastic and comprehensive introduction. This book is really a collective journey, and it reflects on 15 years of working on inclusive urban development in the Global South. The book outlines how current thinking on diversity and intersectionality challenges existing practice of urban development, which builds upon a concept of homogeneous community. And colleagues and contributors are strong advocates of the key role of urban communities to shape their development. And although practice is often problematic, I think we won the argument, and you can hear governments and development agencies talking of what the community want, about what are the aspirations of the community, etc., etc. And in order to make a strong case against top-down development approaches in cities and making a case for the role of communities, activists and scholars whose work informs policy and practice have somehow overlooked important considerations on internal power inequalities and diversity in such communities, and the challenges that such power inequalities present. Sometimes it is even possible to know what an urban community wants, when actually low-income urban settlements are some of the most unequal places in the world. And some of the conceptual ideas of the book around identities and intersectionality have been discussed for at least a couple of decades. However, there has not been an attempt to assess the tensions between internal community diversity and the powerful narrative of community as one actor. And this book explores some ways to deal productively with these permanent tensions. Without dismissing the importance of collective action built on collective identities, the book explores the challenges and tensions in working with diversity if we want fair outcome for all residents. The book addressed three sets of questions. How do development interventions differently affect different groups and individuals? How fairly are the benefits of intervention distributed within urban communities? How are notions of homogeneous static community reproduced in urban planning and development practice, and with what consequence? What are the constraints and power relations that make it difficult for urban planning and development practice to achieve fairer outcomes through the adoption of an intersectional diversity approach? And also the second set is about the extent, to what extent does urban development practice take into account the diversity of needs and aspirations of different groups and individuals? And in what ways does diversity and intersectionality theory contribute to understanding urban communities and the diversity of needs and aspiration of individuals and groups? And finally, what new alternatives for urban development practice emerge from critique of community representation and intersectional analysis? Are there new methodologies emerging that enable fairer forms of representation and meaningful participation of marginalized groups and individuals? And the theme running through all contributions is that diversity matters. And we identify three interlinked aspects of diversity that broadly correspond to the three dimensions of social justice in Nancy Fraser's framework. One is about recognition, the recognition of diversity of aspirations and needs that requires different intervention. One is around redistribution, the diversity of the impact of interventions on different groups and individuals. And finally, participation, the diversity in participation to decision making. The book is structured in three parts. Chapters in the first part highlight how community diversity and intersectionality matter. The second part explores the impact of planning interventions on diverse communities. And the third part maps the space of possibility for just urban development, particularly exploring promises, approaches, and methodologies. Contributions are very diverse in terms of geography, moving from Dhaka to Hong Kong, Accra, Cape Town, La Paz, Harare, Bar Elias in Lebanon, Kathmandu, Freetown, Banjarmasin in Indonesia. They focus on different intersectional identities, disability, gender, class, ethnicity, age, etc., as well as disciplinary perspectives. And it is this diversity of input and approaches that make the book unique in advancing our understanding of these complex relationships. And before passing the microphone to my co-editor Vanessa to introduce a little bit the theoretical framework and some ideas that we developed, bringing all these different inputs together, I would like to express my thanks to her, to Vanessa, for the fantastic experience that has been working together on this project, and also thanking all the contributors who submitted their work during the pandemic. And this has been quite exceptional that they have been able to do this. And finally, also thanking Karen Levy, who helped us making sense of contributions in the conclusions, and also a lot of her thinking underpin other aspects of this book. Over to you, Vanessa.
Thank you, Andrea, and mine is also a task of thanking everybody, because I feel that this book it's been an enormous learning journey. and for me, it's been transformative personally. So it's been wonderful working with all of you, Andrea, and all the authors, and especially Karen Levy, who helped us to make sense at the end and help us write the conclusion of the book. But even though the book has a conclusion, this conclusion is not the end point of anything. And in fact, I feel it's like the beginning, because for me, it's like a box that we have opened about this question of how does inclusive urban development happens in practice, and trying to understand some of the aspects that shape that practice. I think we are only, for me, maybe it's very personal, but we are only starting to think about that. And I heard the other day somebody saying that perhaps we shouldn't continue talking about principles of justice and equity, but rather to think how justice and equity is achieved in practice, even if it's in a small context or in confined situational context. And I thought that was very fitting for this book. So in the conclusion, we particularly discussed this idea of a homogeneous community or community, and why we remain attached to the notion of community. And we see community as being part of this tension. On the one hand, community as an idea continues to support emancipatory political movements and continues to bring people together in collective action and in action towards emancipation and liberation. But on the other hand, as Andrea was explaining, communities are shaped by multiple tensions, and particularly the tension between individual interests and collective identities. And community itself is a value ladder that is open to appropriation. And sometimes we talk about community and we are erasing people's experiences. So one way to make sense of why community continues to attract the imagination of those people who are in communities themselves and ourselves when we form communities and when we form social movements, was thinking about this community identity as a moving target. And this is the idea that we develop in the conclusion, and that builds particularly on Andrea's thinking, as he said, of 15 years thinking this question. And there are these two aspects of identity. On the one hand, of community identity. On the one hand is the simultaneity of these multiple aspects, and the fact that one person's experience or one group experience is not shaped by a fixed identity label that you attach in advance, but rather by the structural constraints in which people live, and that they find them perhaps sometimes as barriers. I really like that metaphor of the wall that Sarah uses in some of her books. And it's this concurrent manifestation of those different identities that make them not reducible to a single aspect or a single label. And on the other hand is this idea of the fluidity of identity and the way identities are ever changing and enacted in successive performances. So when we understand community identity from this perspective as a moving target, we use this framework to look at all the contributions in the book. And then we kind of had these three main reflections about what were the lessons of the book in terms of how community identity continued to be an articulating concept in urban development. On the first place is this question of representation and how different people see themselves or don't see themselves represented in urban development processes. And what a lot of the contributions talk to is that presence is not the same as voice. So it's not enough to have people in the room. You also need to understand how the room itself is influencing their agency, and what can they say and what can they do and how can they contribute to the community, to that political project of the community. And the second insight is that communities clearly are agents of change and can mobilize localized political projects, or maybe not always localized, they mobilize different political projects. but these dynamics of change are ambiguous, both because how change happens has different impacts on people, but also because communities have to make those changes in their community visible for them to be politically viable and politically defendable beyond the community. And finally, this question about power within the community. So power influences relationships outside the community and external to the community, but also shapes how the community operates. And sometimes some of the discourses that people use in international development, sometimes they tend to assume that that power can be put aside. So this is a question, for example, that I get a lot when I talk about participation, and people say, well, but there are also differences of power between the people who are participating. And that's true, but also what a lot of the examples in the book talk to is that you can also engage with those politics within the community and see how they're operating and how they are constructing different possibilities. So the politics cannot be ruled away. They are inherent of the process of urban development. And the final thing that we did was to look through all the contributions and try to identify specific tactics that are used in the name of an imagined or existing community, or to build solidarity across difference. And we make a tactics inventory at the end of the book, in which we reflect on the ways different tactics are used, but also the ways in which different tactics are challenged and maybe sometimes are not operative because of the changing situation. And this is an inventory which is permanently revisable. That is maybe just an initial contribution of something that can make us think about things that work. So ideas like making communities visible, build both presence and voice, deliver different innovations and illustrations, support consciousness raising. So those are all kind of objectives that activists and community members sometimes put forward as a reason to engage with a given community in urban development projects. So this gives you a flavor of the more kind of theoretical engagements of the book, particularly this focus on the notion of community. And I think now we go towards the more detailed presentations, which I think would bring a bit of the richness and empirical richness that is very manifest in other contributions of the book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. That was, between you and Andrea, you've covered the bookends. You've covered the beginning and you've covered the conclusion. And now what's missing is the meat in the middle, or, vegan meat for those of us inclined in those ways. So Jordana is going to give us a little bit of an insight into into the chapter that she's prepared for this book. Jordana Ramalho is a lecturer in urban planning for diversity at the Development Planning Unit at UCL. For the past 15 years, she's been working as a practitioner and consultant in the field of gender mainstreaming, diversity, and socially inclusive development. And I should say that she comes with a wealth of experience that is not just predicated on this idea of the global south, but brings up these linkages that exist between north and south. Her current research explores the socio-spatial politics of displacement, participatory urban governance, and intersectional approaches to urban development. Jordana, over to you.
Thanks, Kamna. Right. Is everyone able to see my screen carefully? Fabulous. Let me just move. Hold on. There. Perfect. All right. Thanks, Kamna, for that introduction. And I just want to extend my thanks and congratulations to Andrea and Vanessa and the other contributing authors on this really important and exciting edited volume that I'm really looking forward to reading. I'm going to share some of the key findings from the chapter that Sylvie and I developed, which explores the intersections between puberty, poverty, and gender equality with a focus on adolescent girls living in slums. But before I do so, wanted to say a few words about my co-author, Sylvia Chant, who's a professor of development geography at the London School of Economics. And she taught and supervised me and really mentored me throughout my master's and PhD, and in so many ways shaped the academic that I am today. And actually, last Friday marked 1.5 years since she passed away. And in many ways, I'd say the timing of this book launch really gives us a chance to celebrate her life's work. So I want to spend some time doing that right now. I'd imagine that many, if not all of you, either knew Sylvia personally or have come across her work at one point or another, given her extensive publications and immense contributions to the field of gender, urban poverty, and development. However, for those of you who perhaps have not had this pleasure, I'm really delighted to be able to introduce you to one of the most critical, generous, and, in my opinion, accessible feminist scholars of our time. Syl was a passionate advocate for gender equality and very much a pioneer in drawing attention to gender issues that were, and in many ways remain, I would say, neglected in development scholarship, policy, and practice. Sylvia started working in this field long before the so-called mainstreaming of gender in international development had taken root. She completed a PhD at UCL in 1984 at a time where there were very few female university students and limited existing research on gender and development. Her thesis, which she impressively finished in 3 years, was one of the first to highlight the important role of women in self-help housing in peri-urban Mexico. And she continued to build on these themes of housing, households, urban poverty, and female labor throughout her impressive career of comparative and longitudinal research, which spanned cities in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and West Africa, and resulted in the publication of 18 books, some of which I've put on the screen here, and more than 150 academic papers. I think she's probably perhaps best known for her work on female-headed households. And within this, she was a very vocal critic of the feminization of poverty and subsequent smart economics discourses, both of which she argued served to homogenize women and men in developing countries by reproducing really problematic and oversimplistic stereotypes. And in so doing, we're failing to recognize people's diverse circumstances, identities, life stages, needs, interests, and experiences. Among her most profound contributions for me personally was her work on the feminization of responsibility and obligation, which, as indicated by the name, highlighted the growing onus on and instrumentalization of poor women to meet development objectives. I was also really inspired by her relentless campaigning efforts against FGM in the Gambia, which eventually contributed to the practice being outlawed there in 2015. Attention to intersectionality across so much of her career. Careful consideration of how space plays development, policy, and practice. And these are the research on which our chapter was based, and I compiled in 2017 with another LSE colleague, Martina Davies, in which we set out to explore the challenges and potential solutions to some of the issues affecting girls aged 14 who were living in urban areas. And this was a project that was commissioned by the Overseas Development Institute as part of a DFID-funded Gender and Adolescence Global Level Evidence Review. And essentially what we concluded from this project was that girls were largely missing from development scholarship and interventions, and that their specific needs were very much being overlooked and neglected by programs that were targeting children or youth, and in that sense thought to kind of encapsulate this demographic. Research also revealed a number of massive constraints and challenges that girls experience as they transition from childhood into adulthood, and especially, as I'll discuss in more detail shortly, when they start menstruating. And to this effect, our chapter really set out to make a case for paying greater attention to the intersectionality of gender, age, and place and space of residence, with a particular focus on pubescent young women who are living in urban slums. So why focus on slums? Well, although there's evidence of urban advantages in health, education, and employment, a sociospatial analysis of these outcomes actually suggests that many of these services and opportunities remain inaccessible to the poorest urban residents, and especially those living in slums who are not only disadvantaged compared to wealthier urban residents, but also often in relation to people who are living in rural areas. And relatedly, while poverty incidence in income terms may be less in urban than rural areas, gendered privations relating to distributions of reproductive labor, exposure to sexual and gender-based violence, as well as vulnerability to HIV and AIDS, for example, might in fact be greater in towns and cities, and is often especially pronounced in informal settlements. Slums are also spaces where girls who migrate to the city in search of work, with or without their families, are likely to end up, and our evidence review identified young female migrants, and especially domestic workers, as particularly vulnerable to exploitation, violence, and isolation. So why should development pay closer attention to adolescent girls? Well, as neatly summarized by Alingo and Abdumalik, adolescent girls experience multiple layers of discrimination on the basis of socially constructed gender roles, but also on the grounds of age, which compounds their marginalization. Typically, they're relegated to the bottom of power structures within the family, the community, and society. And such inequalities in power, privilege, and political agency result in young women being disproportionately affected by the structural exclusions and spatial limitations that characterize many urban poor neighborhoods, resulting in important implications on their health, well-being, and personal advancement. And for girls, the biological and sociocultural changes following their first period makes menarche a particularly significant moment in their lives. Girls who have started menstruating may be expected to dress and behave differently and are often made to take on additional reproductive responsibilities in the household. Absent or inadequate wash infrastructure, which is a common characteristic of urban poor neighborhoods, exacerbates their reproductive responsibilities, requiring them to walk longer distances to collect water for household consumption and care work, which further erodes their already limited time for studying, socializing, or sleeping. Limited access to safe and private toilets and bathing facilities is another major issue affecting adolescent girls living in slums. It makes it really difficult for them to adequately care for their personal hygiene during menstruation, especially in regions where there remains a pervasive stigma about female reproductive health, which in turn can result in numerous physical and mental health issues. Relatedly, the absence of girl-friendly wash facilities in schools causes many girls to miss school for several days every month because they cannot keep their bodies and clothes clean, or due to social norms that impose restrictions on the types of activities and spaces deemed appropriate for women and girls who are menstruating. And in nearly all contexts, we actually see dropout rates increase very rapidly as girls approach puberty, with many girls deciding to leave education entirely. Furthermore, increased surveillance and curtailed mobility in an effort to uphold gendered moral codes that limit female interactions with and potential sexual advances from men is also very common. And whether based on self-censorship or guardian-imposed restrictions, this ends up leading to radically reduced worlds for pubescent girls. And we go into some more, a lot more empirical examples to kind of flesh out these dynamics in different regions. Now, as mentioned previously, findings from a rapid evidence review identified very few interventions targeting adolescent girls in slums in a way that engages them as meaningful stakeholders. However, among the few programs that do focus on this demographic, some common features of good practice emerged, revealing potential entry points and strategies for addressing the unique life stage development needs of adolescent girls. And perhaps one of the most practical ways in which urban development and planning practitioners can help to reduce the stresses and burdens experienced by girls during puberty is by improving the quality and accessibility of wash infrastructure to make them more girl-friendly, so to speak. However, it's really important that these efforts adopt an intersectional approach that takes into account the ways in which access, use, and control of communal spaces and services are mediated by local power relations, and that provisions are put into place to ensure that wash interventions do not end up unwittingly reinforcing existing patterns of exclusion and discrimination. Providing adolescent girls with sanitary products such as pads or cloth, and ensuring that they are accurately informed about safe menstrual hygiene management and have access to confidential family planning and sexual health services is another very tangible way of supporting their menstrual and reproductive health needs. And finally, creating gender and age-specific spaces where young people can come together, build social networks, develop healthy relationships, engage with mentors and role models, and also engage in peer learning and discussion about culturally sensitive topics without fear or repercussion of stigma, was also found to have really meaningful positive impacts on the well-being of adolescent girls. So this is another very practical intervention that could and should be incorporated into development programs. So for time, I'm going to leave things there. I hope I have convincingly made a case for why we should be thinking about adolescent girls. And yeah, looking forward to the discussion. Thank you on behalf of both Sophia and I.
Thank you so much, Jordana. Those are some beautiful memories as well that you shared with us, and lovely picture at the end as well. So thank you for doing that. Modesta is our next speaker. Modesta is, as I mentioned, a former DPU PhD student, and she is currently the lead research fellow on the Data and Displacement Project at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick. Before joining Warwick, Modesta worked as a consultant at the Urban Institute at the University of Sheffield in the Low Act, Low Carbon project, and her research focused on climate change and the complex impacts of oil extraction in Nigeria from an intersectional perspective. Recently, her research has expanded geographically beyond Nigeria to include South Sudan, focusing on the experiences of internally displaced people in these two contexts. Modesta is going to be talking about her chapter on masculinities, I believe. Modesta, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kamna, for that introduction. And I also want to say thanks to Andrea and to Vanesa for bringing this book together. I'm going to present a chapter from, I'm going to present a chapter, which I contributed, to this book. And, the chapter is, was synthesized from my PhD research, which I conducted at the DPU a few years ago. But before I go into explaining what I discussed in my chapter, I want to first of all run through the structure of the discussions I'll be having today. So I'm just going to start by running through, very briefly, what I'll be covering in the discussion, and then I'll go into the main details. I'll first of all start with the context of the Niger Delta area, which is, where my research occurred. And then I will explain the gendered nature of the Niger Delta violence, and explain a few explanations, that's been offered, as regards to why this violence is happening, and then present the objective of my paper, and then explain the theory and the method which I used to carry out the study. And then I will explain the findings of my studies, and then share some reflections in terms of how I think we can move towards a more inclusive youth future, particularly in the context of Nigeria and Niger Delta in particular. So in terms of context, my research occurred in the Niger Delta, like I mentioned, and the Niger Delta is an ecologically sensitive region. It has a vast, area of, mangrove forest and freshwater and swampland. And in Nigeria, we have Nigeria is a multi-ethnic country, and we have we have three major ethnic groups, but we also have the ethnic minorities, and the people from the people in the Niger Delta are part of this ethnic minority. For the most part, and many of them survive on subsistence, livelihood, as and also petty trading. And also, in terms of local leadership, local leadership in the region is organized mainly by, a gerontocratic, leadership structure, where the older male often are in charge of, leadership positions. So oil exploration, started to occur in this region in 1956, and within this period, land was essentially communal property in Nigeria, and Nigeria also operated a different kind of institutional, governance system, where the regions controlled most of the resources, generated, within their territories. However, after oil was, discovered and then began to be commercialized, there were different institutional mechanisms, they were introduced in Nigeria. So, for example, the Land Use Act was introduced in 1978, which essentially translated land from a communal property to now the property of the federal government. And we also have the derivation principle, which established, the basis of sharing the oil, the profits from oil across the 36 states in Nigeria. And we also have the federation account, which established that the proceeds from oil is now going to be shared on the basis of population. And by implication, what that means is that the oil producing communities, because they are the ethnic minorities, they've not really participated very much as they would expect in terms of sharing in the profits of oil production. Also, as oil exploration continued, pollution escalated in the Niger Delta. And at the moment, statistics show that about 240 barrels of oil is spilled yearly in the Niger Delta, and which makes the region the world pollution capital, according to reports from BBC. So in the context of these institutional changes and experiences of livelihood loss and deep feelings of exclusion, violence erupted in the region. And local communities on the one hand, are resisting the oil companies and the federal government, who they blame for the experiences of oil exclusion. But the way in which this violence is happening is that young men are the main actors in this violence. Youth in particular are actually at the front line of this violence. But it's usually young men who are very seriously engaged in the violent resistance in this contemporary violence. And also due to the geopolitical relevance of Nigeria as a major oil exporter in the continent of Africa, there is a lot of interest in really trying to explain why this violence is happening due to the impact that it has on the global oil supply. But one of the dominant accounts of this violence, blame young people and the young men in particular for this violence. And we can see the sources that I've just included. And in many of these accounts, the grievances that actually underline why this violence is happening in the first place is either minimized or they are dismissed completely. So there are some gendered accounts of this violence, but to the most part, they are really very homogeneous. They do not explain in more detail, what, for example, unemployment means in the local context. So that gap in the literature, partly underscored, what the objective of my research was. So I wanted to really offer some thoughts, on how young men in particular experience this violence. So I wanted to add their voices, to the conversations about, youth violence in the Niger Delta. And I did not just really want to just add their voice because, as Vanessa has said, it's not just about, the presence. I wanted to really engage with the diversities, in which they are really experiencing this exclusion in the region. So to be able to really explain that, I engaged with two main research questions. One was, I wanted to understand how oil exploration, as I said, shape young men's experiences in the Niger Delta. But then I also wanted to understand, what these experiences can teach us in terms of how we can build inclusive urban futures in the context of Nigeria. So in terms of the methods, I traveled to Nigeria and I spent about 8 months collecting primary, data from young people. So I interviewed about 70 young men in particular, and also young women, but I did not include the voices of the young women in this particular paper. So I engaged with them to sort of, understand, how they experience violence, emerging from the oil exploration on a day-to-day basis. And in terms of theory, I used two main theories, to sort of, try to analyze the link between men and violence in this particular chapter. So one of the theories I used is the theory on hegemonic masculinity. And what this theory tries to do is that it really tries to engage the relationship, explain the relationship between gender systems and social transformations. And the theory also explains that, there are dominant expectations about how men should act and feel in the society, and that men are struggling to really meet with these, dominant expectations in the context of social changes and exclusion. And that when these then when these social transformations, collide with gender identity, violence occurs. So in other words, in the context of exclusion, young men try to use violence, for example, as a way to get by in life. And I used both these habits in particular also in this chapter to explain how gender structures get reproduced through get reproduced through youth agency, and to also explain the variations in terms of gender identity. So in terms of what I found from the research, I found that by speaking to many young people, there is a very big sense in which many of the youths that I spoke to, these young men, feel that Nigeria does not work for them. Many of them complain that instead of sharing really in Nigeria's oil profit, they feel that what is really their own experiences, the experiences of violence in terms of exclusion, both in the physical sense as bodily harm, but also in the structural form also as exclusion. And in more particular, many of these young men explained that that they are that they are being very much excluded from the national and from the political from the local and national political life because of like I explained before, due to the hierarchies of age in which the the leadership structure is organized in the local context. And also many of them, particularly the men, explained that even though that oil has brought a lot of economic progress for the country, that many of them are still very much underemployed, and that also oil spill is kind of also compounding the experiences of unemployment because their livelihood is largely undermined. And also many of them complained about constant experiences of police brutality, which causes bodily injury on their body almost on a daily basis, and other kinds of harassment, that also escalates their experiences of bodily injury. And many of them, particularly from the Ogoni tribe, also explained to me that that the experiences of about their daily experiences of ecological and ecological harm. I forgot to mention in the previous slide actually that I interviewed young men, particularly from two different ethnic groups in the Niger Delta, which includes the Ogoni ethnic groups and the Ijo ethnic groups. And the reason I chose these two ethnic groups was because they feature very, very frequently in terms of violence in the region, either in terms of physical violence and confronting the Nigerians the Nigerian government, or just in terms of just resisting oil operation due to the impact that is having on their environment in the case of the Ogoni communities. So also from my findings also, I discovered that there are differences in terms of the way that Ijo men and Ogoni men also experience this exclusion. So for the Ijo men, majority of them shared experiences of bodily harm, and what could explain that is because many of them are socialized, to see themselves as warriors in their communities, which requires them to sort of position their bodies to protect their communities, which means that they have to use their bodies, to resist the government, an equally violent state. But despite the differences in terms of the significant experiences of bodily harm by German, I find that the experiences of unemployment was similar across the two different group of men that I spoke to. And unemployment has very huge social consequence for young men, because many of them explained to me that they're supposed to marry and they're supposed to be the providers of their families, and in the context of unemployment many of them do not have the money to do this, because, marriage is a very expensive and elaborate process in Nigeria, requiring lots of money. And without money, many of these young men just found themselves in a constant limbo as youth, and they're not really able to sort of, move from being junior men to senior men in their community, which also, compounds the experiences of, social exclusion in their own local context. What I also find is that, many of these young men, for example, who were now who engage with violence, many of them were able to get money, and they got money because in many ways, for example, many of them are being used by the politicians, for example, to sort of, oppress opponents and to sort of, win elections. And many of them get paid really, really very high for this. And also many of them are also being used by the, are being hired by the oil companies to sort of, protect the oil communities. And they also make money like that. So in the clubs, for example, when I visited the clubs in Port Harcourt, many of these young militants don't really have the kind of lives that, the ordinary, young men have. They are being celebrated because of their wealth, and they also have sort of, social recognition, because of the kind of sometimes, designer labels that they have and the kind of champagnes that they ordered in the, in the clubs. So, this leads me to my, conclusion that, violence, for many of these young men is, is a way to sort of, gain recognition and to sort of, navigate their experiences of exclusion, albeit to the back door. In terms of, what these experiences, can teach us in terms of how we can build an inclusive youth future. I think that, it's very important, for us to sort of, start thinking about, how we can make men, how we can emphasize, male identity that does not have to do with violence. And I also think that also, it's very important for us to address, the diverse needs of, young men and women, many of whom are living at the margins of the oil communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Modesta. That was fascinating. I really appreciate the detail that you went through in taking us around the story of how these young men live and work in the area. So much appreciated. I'm going to move now on to our final speaker for this book launch, who's our discussant. It's my pleasure to introduce Taibat Launson. Dr. Taibat Launson is an associate professor of urban planning at the University of Lagos in Nigeria, where she leads the Pro-Poor Development Research Cluster and serves as co-director at the Center for Housing and Sustainable Development. Her research focuses on the interface of social complexities, urban realities, and the quest for environmental justice. She's a member of the Board of Directors of Lagos Studies Association and a member of the International Advisory Committee on UN Habitat's flagship State of the World's Cities report. Taibat, over to you.
Right, thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to this very august book launch. Congratulations to Andrea and Vanesa for this really important work that crystallizes the importance of communities. And I will speak to 4 major issues regarding the book and the presentations that have been made already. The first is that communities are important. And I will also speak in the context of my city, Lagos, which is probably the largest African city and definitely one of the most complex urban places on the face of the earth. Communities are important, especially in the context of large cities, because it gives one a sense of grounding and a sense of belonging. In a city like Lagos with 23 million people, there has to be, a recognition of, this small microcosm that one can call their own. And in the context of Lagos, particularly with regards to the governance gaps, communities perpetually step in to bridge the gaps, whether with regards to infrastructure, physical and social, and many times, with regards to the various challenges of urban life. The second thing is that communities have agency. And in the context of many cities in the global south, particularly with regards to low-income communities, the agency is not recognized. And that agency is what enables people, these often demographic majority, to live, to survive, and to move forward. Local communities, low-income communities often are lacking in tenure security and attendant access to basic services, and it is their ability to collaborate, to co-produce the solutions that work for them, sometimes in defiance, sometimes in defiance to the law, sometimes taking on a measure of subterfuge, what is allowed and what is not, but they are able to use the currency of collaboration, to make do in the city. And then in the context of Lagos again, the community agency is not limited to low-income communities. It is across low and middle-income communities. Currently, we are challenged with security challenges, but maybe because of the urban youth bulge, urban youth and unemployment that crystallizes in crime. And so communities have to step up and protect themselves. And both low-income and middle-income and high-income community resort to self-help measures to protect themselves through different means, while the low-income communities are using things like the vigilante groups and the having the men in the community stay up late to protect their communities. Higher income communities levy themselves, erect street gates, and levy themselves to employ private security. So the sense of communal living, is in Lagos, especially, is not limited to low income or marginalized communities. Anyway, for many of us in Lagos, the surviving in that city already is a challenge. The third thing I want to talk about is with regards to planning. Urban and regional planning practice there is a measure of complexity or tension around the conservative outlook of the profession that is meant to have a social justice objective. And that, plays out quite frequently in a city like Lagos, where the apparatus of the state seeks to kind of break the communities, especially the indigenous communities who are now, described as slums. And you find that the instrument of planning is being used to protect the elitist notion of what an ideal city should be. And then it brings to question what then, the very notion of what is the ideal city or what is a livable city. And then we ask, livable for who? Sustainable for who? And the very standards that the planning apparatus are built on, they are then called to question. And I will say that there is a need for us to revisit some of the governance paradigms and particularly the planning administrative frameworks in our cities. Then the fourth thing I would like to talk about is the issues around citizenship. In many cities, citizenship is a function of socioeconomic status, and that's what determines how people are able to access the benefits and the resources of urban life. When you were giving the introduction, Kamna, you talked about the complexities within, between, and across cities. And I reflect on that and say that in a city like Lagos, within cities, we have challenges with regards to gender and with regards to life stage. And so the patriarchy, does not allow many women to aspire to their highest ability or their highest capacity, particularly younger girls like Jordana had mentioned spoke about in her presentation. And then we have the challenge of age. We also live in a very hierarchical society where young people, are not given the the permission of essentially young people have to struggle or assert themselves to be able to be heard. We know about the NSAS that happened last year. That was a clear agitation on the, and a rejection of the hostility, that the city had placed upon young people in their daily lives. Because interestingly, the most vulnerable young people that were attacked, that were subject to this police brutality, were young people in the tech industry who had to go around with their laptops. And when we're looking at between communities, then you see the gaps in access to provision, access to basic services, access to things as simple as drainage in a city, that is under the water line. And so while the whole city is vulnerable for flooding, certain communities will get flooded earlier or more intensely than others, simply because of the socioeconomic status of those living there. And then when we look across, communities, we start to talk about issues around political access, issues around fragmentation, with regards to the propensity, for example, for the government to go into the construction of these gated communities, to form these islands of exclusivity, which are communities in themselves, but are tending to disrupt the cohesive nature of the city. And then when we look at it, some of the things that particularly low-income communities are doing to kind of make a space for themselves and work towards a better urban future, they are sometimes not recognized, and but they continue to push. And that speaks to the resilience, particularly of low-income communities. I speak of one. During the lockdown, occasioned by COVID, many of the low-income communities, because they work in an informal economy, could not work because they couldn't move out of their homes or couldn't move out of the communities. And so immediately the apparatus of being your brother's keepers, went into motion, and you have neighbors that were sharing resources, sharing food with their other neighbors that were indigent and all of that. There were community-led efforts for hand washing, education, social mobilization regarding things like that. And in a community that we worked with, it was a perfect opportunity for them to prioritize their interests. According to them, well, for a lot of people in Lagos, COVID is a rich man's issue because it's those who travel and things like that that are impacted. But they saw it as an opportunity to actually develop a community resilience action plan. The Center for Housing supported them in that, on that journey. And they were able to come up with a resilience action plan that prioritized 5 areas in which they wanted intervention. They were able to use that document, based on their assets, what was on the ground and what they felt was most important to them. And right now we are able to use that document to negotiate with government on bringing change into their local communities. And it was essentially, community-led. And that is one of the things that I would say that this book seeks to amplify, documenting community-led processes of urban transformation and pushing for more of that. And then the second one is the rethinking of what planning practice really, should be. What should be, the focus of the planning agencies in transforming the city? What type of city are we building? And when we talk about building a livable city, I then ask, a livable city for who? And finally, the issue of urbanization at scale. Communities across the board are able, to bring some agency to the table, are able to transform, their local spaces. But how do we get all this into a cohesive whole that pushes our cities towards a more desirable future? So I would say that in the building of a just, inclusive city, we must emphasize on practices that leave no one behind and practices that amplify the agency of the urban core. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Toba. Those are some remarkably insightful comments that you've made, and I think they'll be resonating with a lot of us as we're thinking through what is it that we want to ask our contributors. Somebody who's already done that thinking is Barbara. So Barbara, I know that you're active in the chat.
Yes.
Can I ask?
I've been loving all these inputs and trying hard to ask questions. Well, not so hard because they're very thought-provoking, but I thought it would be nice to get the conversation going. And again, just to congratulate all of you for such really very rich and exciting inputs. So don't feel obliged to state these questions.
No, I think they're good questions, Barbara. So I'm going to then read out the first one. Okay, this one is centered towards Jordana. Barbara writes, I like the focus on practical tactics, some of which may go some way in dovetailing patriarchal conservative structures. Does your chapter engage with the politics of introducing such tactics in particular contexts?
Thanks for the question, Barbara. Beautifully read, Cameron. Yeah, I guess it does indirectly when we take a look at some of the projects that were taking place in different countries. And I think the main, again, practical tip around how to kind of navigate those politics that I would say came through the interventions that we identified was kind of relates to Vanessa and Andrea's lovely diagram, actually, in the sense of like, how do you build consciousness? How do you connect with community? And really mobilize your interventions to kind of circumvent power relations. And I think a key way in which NGOs or community-based organizations that are operating in an interest of trying to address like a lot of the issues affecting adolescent girls are doing that is by working directly with schools, working directly with connecting with community spaces where there are power nodes. So that might be with like local imams, with like religious centers, with community chiefs and leaders. And often having a mediator, so to speak, they're often termed mentors, but like someone who can kind of bridge the gap between kind of childhood, adolescence, and some of what both Modesta and Taibat were kind of touching on around the gerontological or like the age-related discrimination that exists in many cultures, where like if you are under the age of 35, you don't necessarily have a voice. You're not given space to kind of engage on an equal kind of playing field. So they bring in people who can be that balance and kind of speak for young people, representing their interests. And that includes, I think that's done really interestingly in the case of domestic workers whose kind of ownership is down to their employers. And so trying to engage with like young lone female migrants in the city who might be like basically kept in employers' homes, a way in which they were able to do so was by having mentors who were kind of respected in the community to get the trust of the employers to allow their domestic workers to be able to come out for an hour or two every day and engage in these spaces. So yeah, I hope that helps to answer your question, and thanks.
Katie, Madalena, Maria, please feel free to ask anything that you want to ask. We don't have to write it in the chat. There are so few of us that it's nice to just turn this into more of an open conversation. Oh, and Adina as well. I'm sorry, I didn't catch you there. So please feel free to share your reflections perhaps on some of the things that you've heard regarding this, this book. In the meantime, Modesta, Barbara had written a question for you, and then rather than me reading it out, Barbara, maybe you could voice it to Modesta?
Sure. So let me try and go back to it because I was thinking about other questions. So Modesta, yes. So I mean, you paint such an interesting picture of this young man feeling trapped in gender system, and I think that's something that's often forgotten when we make these depictions of young violent men. So it's really, really interesting that you pick that angle. And I was wondering whether you saw this as being something that was talked about more, something that was becoming more visible, something that was more in current discussions, and whether you saw any forms of groups or again, tactics, practical steps to try and find other ways for these young men to be communal. I also really liked your phrasing of how men could re-envisage their masculinity.
Modesta, in case you don't know, you're muted, so please unmute.
I'm so bad with technology. I apologize. Sorry. Yeah, so I was trying to answer that in terms of visibility, yes, there is a lot of momentum, growing in terms of, the, awareness in terms of, how we can start to challenge this dominant but very sort of, not very healthy or toxic, kind of masculinity. But I think that what was really very interesting in my finding is that this kind of, is that, the young men themselves are also being very reflective in terms of what this masculinity means for them. So, for example, I spoke to many young men, from the Ijo ethnic group, although many of them understand how this, sort of culture helps them to sort of, navigate these experiences of exclusion. They are also really very, very aware of the kind of harm that it presents to their bodies. And many of them that I spoke to, for example, told me that, this culture is really, really very harmful. But then also, that culture is also a very sensitive topic. So it's not something, it has purpose, and whether you say the purpose is good or right, it still has purpose, for the people that are, that are engaging with it. So it's kind of, one area that I would like to explore further in terms of, my future research. I haven't seen like groups per se engaging with, ways to sort of, start looking for how to build this communal way of being, this communal sense of manhood that does not entail violence. Yeah, I haven't seen, groups engaging with that in the context of, Nigeria in particular. I do see some groups that I can't remember their name, thinking about that, for instance, in the context of the UK. But I've not come in contact with any groups that are sort of, engaging with that, but in a much more dissipated, form. For example, there is a lot of awareness also, going on, for example, on social media, where men share their experiences, and even in the Nigerian context, and they explain how what this means for them, and just sort of learning lessons in terms of how we can move forward from here to a much more healthy place in terms of gender relations. But I don't have an example of one particular group. But I also would want to, sort of, see policies also engage, with this kind of, issue, because, without the policies, I know that having this conversation, for example, on an individual level, also in the family, is also one way that we can also sort of, start to really challenge this, this very toxic, gender systems. But I don't have, I can't remember one group, for example, that is engaging with that in the context of Nigeria.
Thanks.
Okay, I'd like to, Jordana, you have something that you want to say in relation to Modesta's response.
Yeah, thanks, Kamna. I have a question actually that kind of builds on some of what you were saying there, Modesta, and I was really wondering if you could like speak a little bit more. It came up at points in your presentation. Can you, is it possible even to kind of summarize in any way how you see the kind of significance of ethnicity among the respondents that you spoke to, in that intersectional dimension between kind of like ethnic identity, age, and the broader kind of politics of living in the Delta region? If you have any kind of broader insights or comments that you can share on that in particular, I'd love to hear them. And connected with that, I was wondering, like, I know that you didn't share, though it's not connected explicitly with the chapter, but I was wondering if you could give us any insights into female respondents' perspectives on these issues, and again, if there were any kind of overlaps, or what role does ethnic identity play in how people experience and try to kind of manage gendered performances in a broader sense.
That's
Yeah. So I was saying that I'll start with the simpler question, which is about, my engagement with the female, with the female interviewees. I spoke to about 14 women in total, which is very, very small number compared to 70 group of young men that I focused on, because, I was particularly interested in really understanding the experiences of men. So the details that I have about the young men's experiences, sort of is very, very big compared to the details I have. I have very small details because of the smaller number of the women that I spoke to. But when the women spoke to me about the experiences of violence, for example, they spoke about unemployment, but they did not speak about unemployment, particularly in the context of what it means in terms of how it undermines their everyday lives as people. So they spoke to me about unemployment as just in the broader sense of, how the institutions, sort of, undermine their economic progress, but it didn't have a lot of meaning as to the expectations of, being able to get married and being able to provide, as the men really explained to me. And this difference was really, really very obvious because in the men, on a day-to-day basis, for example, when I spoke to the men, they were very, very proud to flaunt their, their new status of very well recognized, men that had more money in our daily interactions. So when they, they told me, for example, very explicitly that, that they have money, that, that unlike, what the government thought was going to be happening to them, that they, that with violence, they'll be able to really challenge the system and to kind of bring to a halt the Nigerian oil production industry, which really allows them to really make money. So they really flaunted their membership in the new wealthy men's club, particularly when you go to the club and even in the church, and even in social functions like like during wedding ceremonies. You could see really very how proud they were to be identified as very, very rich men. The women in particular did not speak about that that exclusion in terms of that sort of power that it kind of helps them to acquire. I can't remember your second question again.
Can I ask, Modesta, it was more about the women and what your female respondents said. I think that was it.
Yeah, okay.
Can I ask you to just pause on that, because we only have about 13 minutes left, and I want to bring Taibat back into the conversation, and Andrea as well, who's been quietly listening and observing to these conversations. I'd like us to zoom out a little bit from the particularities of the cases that were presented by Jordana and Modesta, and to ask a little bit around the role of city planning. And Taibat, this is building on Barbara's question that was put into the chat, and whether you can see any, or if you can think of some examples, or Barbara's used the word vectors, where there can be a coalition around changing the direction of cities, planning for cities in a different way, in a more equitable way, in an inclusive way, that works across difference, that works across group interests. So you ended your remarks by saying a livable city for whom? If we keep that in our minds, then are there particular things that have happened in a city or particular instances that you can think of around which these identities can come together so that there's a common sense of moving towards a bigger picture?
Yes, for me, I see the current planning paradigms, the current planning frameworks as quite rigid and trying to force everything into a box of what planning should be, what an ideal city should be, what, how many buildings should be in a community, how many schools a certain population should serve. So the standards are there, and they're trying to force the the dynamism of human interaction and everyday life into these boxes. So for me, the important thing will be for, for a shift in planning practice from the focus on reordering of the city to some more dynamism and some more fluidity, some more creative, approach to the practice of planning, for the planning framework to see the human, as the fulcrum of society, and then, apply, for me, I think from planning, a shift from the planner from being an enforcer of the ideal environment to be a facilitator for urban transformation. That is what I would say, is required. And then we need to kind of loosen up some of those really tight screws in planning education, in planning practice, to allow for more of, things don't necessarily have to be straight-jacketed. They don't have to be as messy as, they are in some of the communities. But if there was some fluidity and if there was some understanding of how the city works, as against trying to force it into, a particular shape, then, the planner's work will be more beneficial to everyone. So it's a fundamental issue that needs to be looked at. The other thing is the relationship between the planner and the decision makers, the policy makers. Policy makers in this neck of the woods often have very idealistic aspirations or ideas of how cities should be. My own city, for example, is aspiring to be like Dubai with all the skyscrapers and all of that, no matter how contextually, misaligned that is with our realities. So that's another place that in envisioning the future city and in operationalizing it, we also need to find a way to break or to bridge, that gap between what the decision maker wants, what the planner is able to provide, and what people really need, for their best experience.
You're on mute now, Kamna.
Thanks, Jordana. Andrea, I wanted to ask you a question now that picks up on some of what Taibat was talking about, around this idea of, there needs to be these productive conversations to make real an inclusive city or an inclusive urban space between the policymakers, between the planners, and between the people. And so much of your book is dissecting the people and identifying that the people is not one mass, and of course is broken down and can be imagined in these multiple different ways. I want to ask, what do you think that does, or based on your own experiences, what does that do to the power dynamics within these planning processes? And Vanessa mentioned about this idea of leaning into power almost. I don't think she quite used that term, but leaning into the power that these different group identities can produce in and of themselves. But is there a risk in flattening power as well, so that we still end up with this notion of the people without working out the intricacies of how different constituencies of folks have different types of power in different contexts? So in working with planners and policymakers, is there space for this complexity?
I mean, we did the book because we think that there is this space for this complexity. And I think the important thing to say is we recognize the importance of collective identities as a way of bringing political demands to decision makers and policymakers. It certainly is not about individuals with all their diversity going to policymakers, but so it's collective identities and collective aggregation of demands is fundamental, as a fundamental process in urban development and in all sorts of other aspects of making claims. What we wanted to do with this book was both to speak to community leaders themselves that sometimes lead these collective efforts, as well as policymakers on the other side, to say, be aware that while this process is fundamental and is super important, there are some tension there. Because sometimes in the process of making a collective demand, we forget that our constituency is more problematic than just speaking with one voice. So with sometimes this simplification that we must make, the simplification, and there is an important role that community leaders and policymakers play in creating these simplifications that then are needed for negotiation and in the end to make a specific claim. And when but at the same time we told them, be careful with this, because there might be some people who get completely excluded by this, some people whose voices won't be heard by this, and also to the policymaker, be aware that sometimes these collective demands hide, especially when there are power relations, certain other demands. And for example, a conversation we have been having with this book, because we received some criticism from some early readers. They were saying, well, what about when we talk about solidarity? And so there we think that it's very important when there is this idea about solidarities across differences and solidarity between different collective identities. And that's very much possible, but we also need to be aware of when actually instead what is happening is a solidarity between different elites, and that's actually is a way to reproduce the power imbalances. So I think it's very important to, sometimes we have powerful landowners together with powerful politicians across different sectors working in solidarity to protect their interests, and that's not the kind of solidarity that we want. Actually, I would say that's not solidarity. So I think it's it's a tension, and as we say in the books a few times, I don't think the book offers a solution. You don't escape this tension. It's a tension you need to live with all the time, and with this shifting identity as has been mentioned. And yeah, we need to learn with it. We need to find a compromise at this stage, listening the voices, listening the actors, making new syntheses, making mistakes sometimes and that is a conflictual process. So that is not that sort of a win-win. We just bring our interests together and everyone will be happy because we will find a solution that will make Hora happy. And very often when we come up with a solution that we think is making everyone happy, is because we are forgetting some people, probably.
Thank you, Andrea. Modesta had a question for you. But Modesta, can I ask you to keep your question as short as possible? And Andrea, your response similarly, please. Go ahead, Modesta.
Yeah, it's a very, very short and simple question. So Andrea, when you're working with policymakers and you're trying to explain power to them, how do you really explain power in a way that allows them to engage without making it look like you're trying to sort of, critique them? Like, how do you really operationalize power when you're speaking with them?
Well, to speak about, one aspect of power that this book brings about very clearly, which is this sort of power relations within communities. I think the first part of the book is fantastic because all the chapters basically show how these power relations within the community matters. And so really showing even concrete examples from Bolivia to Kathmandu to Harare, and showing how these internal differences matters. And therefore, if they think about that in a settlement, there is a community all with the same interest, that I can just find out what the entire community want and then provide one response to that. These chapters of the first part of the book show that that's simply not possible. And maybe, given I think this is going to be my last answer, I really want to thank you, Kamna, so much for chairing this event. And Taibat, of course, to agree to be discussed and bringing all these inputs. And it's been a very special moment. And of course, the other presenters. I don't want to steal the role from Kamna, but as an editor of the book, I feel very. I feel you have made me a great gift to come to this event and to provide these super interesting inputs.
You didn't steal what I was going to say at all. I just wanted to thank everyone for coming this afternoon and to congratulate Andrea, Vanessa, Modesta and Jordana on a fantastic book. I read many of your contributions last night as I was going through the book online, and it truly is a terrific contribution and re-energizes some conversations around concepts such as intersectionality and how they travel in different parts of the world and into different contexts. And there's a lot of utility in that term. So I am personally grateful for your book and for the contributions and the conversations that you're igniting in spaces outside of this forum as well. So thank you all, and thank you to our questionnaires and silent participants. It's wonderful to have you here, and have a good conference, everyone. I shall see you in another session.